Alfred George Flohr.
And can you spell it for me?
Which one?
All your
Alfred?
names. All
Yeah,
your names,
which
yeah.
with Alfred. George, George. Flohr, Flohr.
All right. And what's your birthday, Al?
April 1st, 1925.
April Fool's Day. Love it.
Uh,
And what branch of service did you serve in?
Navy.
And when did you get in the Navy? And when did you get out of the Navy?
I got in the Navy, 1st of April in 1942, and I got out on the 1st of April 1946.
And what was the highest rank that you attained?
I was PO second class, torpedoman.
All right. Al, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood and maybe what your mom and dad did for a living? Just kind of paint us a picture of what it was like growing up.
My childhood wasn't all that great, for one thing, because my mother and father didn't get along, and according to my family tree that I have, quite a bit of it, every time they had an argument, my father used to go home to Mama. And that went on so long till they were divorced. Well, then I was with my mother till I was 7 years old. This was during the Depression era. And my father had remarried, and they figured they'd save the few dollars support money, so they wanted to know if my mother would turn me over to them because she had legal over me as a child, which she did. But she had made a stipulation that they were supposed to legally adopt me, and that's what they agreed on. Now, this is all I found out along the line as I got older by a friend of my mother that I knew, and I ran into her in my hometown one time, and she told me all about it, that they never did adopt me. So I was kind of kicked around the whole relation all the times as a child, you know, grandma and grandpa, my aunt, my so-and-so uncles. So it was kind of, my father had a mom and pop nursery system. We had he was very mechanical also. And he cut the top of the garage off, put a greenhouse. But after they got me, when I was 7 years old, I was basically child labor because there was all the work to be done and so forth, like hauling water up to the greenhouse in the winter and all that stuff. So I wasn't a very happy child. So when the war started, had opened the door for me.
And Al, what can you tell me about the attack on Pearl Harbor? Do you remember what you were doing when you found out?
Well, yes. I went through Great Lakes first, and in the public school, though, I was very mechanically inclined. And through the school I took all the courses like drafting, machine shop, woodworking, foundry, you know, all those classes. So, and my father was a machinist, and he was very mechanically also. And like we had this flower business, they had the whole yard was like a park, you know, lit up at night with flowers and everything that people would come and look at. So I learned a lot, and about the time I was 10 or 12, in the winter months, I was in the basement on a 10-inch saw making the flats to put the little seedlings in. I did a lot of that kind of work, and delivered all the seedlings and plants and stuff to his customers, and so I learned quite a bit. And when I got in the Navy at the Great Lakes, they kind of got that same information from me. So for a while, they put me in a machine shop there to see what I could do, and I did well. So then I was with a group, went to Pearl Harbor, and of course in the Navy, when your first assignment, you're put on KP duty, kitchen, and the place where I was was the way Pearl Harbor is arranged on the east side of the harbor. There was a little island called Kahula Island, which the Navy had attached to the mainland. And on that island was two big buildings. One was a torpedo shop where they overhauled and all the torpedoes, replace them on the ships that came in. And a mine shop was the other one. And of course, that's where, and the Navy flag was there, and camera department was there. On the north side of that island, where that all was, and a mess cook and galley and all that, right across, you could look at it, was Battleship Row, where they bombed all our battleships. That was called Ford Island. And on the end of that island was our air base. And so in the evening, when we were all done in the mess hall, what are you going to do? You know, you're free to roam around. And so I wandered up to this big building and went in, and I seen all these torpedoes, and there were guys working on them, and so I watched. And it's what I did every night. And there was 3 stands that fellows overhauled the engines on the torpedoes. Well, I was familiar with tools and everything, you know, so I watched this one fella, and he was overhauling the engine, and he said, hand me that kid, you know, which I did. So pretty soon I could see he was doing this, overhauling this engine. And then it came a time, I don't know if he was transferred or what happened, but he was transferred out of there, but he told the officer in charge that I was pretty qualified, that maybe he should have me come over there to work. So the officer asked me, would you like to work here? And I said, certainly. Well, I think I was about 18 then, and they put me on this job where this fellow was overhauling the engines, and that's what I was doing then.
And so Al, real quick, I realize I should have been more specific about my question. What do you remember about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was there after the attack, you know.
No, I understand, but as someone who learned about the news happening, you know, do you remember December 7th where you were?
Oh, certainly. I was at home, you know, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, going to school. And then when the war started, that's where I thought I wanted to join the Navy. And that was quite a story. I don't think you wanted me to go through all that, how I got to enlist, because I was in Milwaukee and I had to go to Chicago, be examined and all that.
I'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, well, it turned out, being that young, I was certainly in good shape. Other than they found out that I had a high rate of albumin, and which they rejected me then because they figured that you might be a bedwetter, which I never was, but that's what they figured, so they turned me down. But they did tell me if I could check my urine in the morning and how to do it, which I did. I had a chemistry set, and they told me I should, the first thing when I urinated in the morning was to test the urine. Well, in the basement we had a little gas stove where they used to heat the water for doing the laundry and all that. And so I did. I took my test tube and put some urine in it and heated it like he told me, and it would be clear. But later in the day, I check it, it would be clouded. So I had made up my mind, well, I just guess I got to hold it and go to Chicago. And we had an interurban that ran from Milwaukee to Chicago that I had to get on and go to Chicago. It's about 90 miles. And I got up there to the enlistment board and it was clear. So they took me. And I never had any problem.
And what was your basic training like? Can you take me through that?
Basic training? Well, most of it was started right away at Pearl there in that torpedo shop. Oh, the basic training at Great Lakes, you mean? Well, I know they put me in the machine shops there for a while before they shipped us to Pearl Harbor. So I imagine that went on my record or something, that I was mechanically inclined. And I did well overhauling the torpedo engines. And when this deal came up about the destroyer, they shipped me back to the States on a transport. And we went into Puget Sound, into the Navy base up there, and then I had put on a train, and I went down to San Francisco to Mare Island. That's where the ship was being rebuilt. And when I got there, they had all the machinery done on the ship, but the deck house and the stacks and the torpedo mount and all that was sitting on the pier, on the dock. And the thing is, what happened when we had to make a test, the ship had to go through a test to be able to qualify to go back into combat. So we took the test we had a lot of civilian engineers on it, and at full speed, the destroyer vibrated like mad. So there was a problem. So we went back, and they ended up, we had to wait. They provided 2 more screws, which were 4-bladed screws instead of 3 like most of them were. And I think I'm getting ahead of the story a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you,
yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about World War II torpedoes? You know, you were working on them and at Pearl Harbor. How did they work? What was interesting about them?
Well, they were not a reciprocating engine. They were a turbine-driven engine, and it was each screws went one way and then the other one went the other way. So they would be in reverse, the turbines. And there was a center piece that was formed, metal formed, that you built the engine up from, the shafting, and I'll never forget that it had 85 loose ball bearings that you had to put in it. And then you built the engine up from that. And then after you got the engine overhauled, you had to put it in a test stand. And of course, then it was not on fuel, it was run on air. And it had to have a certain amount of rundown time that would be accepted. And so then the engine was put in the after body of a torpedo and onto the air flask, and it was put in a big rack. And it was, hundreds of them in these racks all the way to the ceiling of this big, well, it was like a warehouse building, big. So I was, and then also I would go on what they call a sampan. It's a small boat engine powered, and I would go out and we would retrieve torpedoes that ships would fire that we give them, and we would retrieve them because the warhead would fill with air and bring it to the surface, and we had to watch for them, and then we would retrieve it and take it to a seagoing tug, and they would bring it back to the shop where we would overhaul them, and the ship would be getting fresh ones from, that had been overhauled. And it was located in Pearl Harbor. It was right next to us was the submarine base that we took torpedoes down and changed them out on the submarines too. And any other ship, like destroyers mostly, had a torpedo mount, so we change them out and then they go back to sea. So.
Now, you mentioned you ended up on a destroyer, but it was getting repaired. Had it sustained damage?
Well, it was hit with a 500-pound bomb at Biak, New Guinea, so it had pretty much major. That's the part I got ahead of myself telling you. The ship was a Benson class, meaning it was built in 1941, and I think by Bethlehem Steel. And the thing is, it was a 1750-ton ship, 2,950 tons when it was loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food, and so forth. And it turned out that I was standing, they didn't have an engine to replace it because the bomb had hit forward on the starboard side, and it hit the stack and the torpedo mount. And when it blew up the torpedo mount all apart, and was a lot of stuff flying around, see. But so I can't get ahead of myself here. The next new model destroyer was called the Fletcher class. It was a 2,100 ton. And of course, they had bigger engines in it. So what they did, they reversed, I think, the engines and put 2,100 engines in our 1750 ship. And with the four-bladed props, it just was like a hot rod. So we used to get, when I worked with the 3rd and 5th Fleet, we got a lot of duty where we could run around quickly to the bigger, like the aircraft carrier or a battleship, for some reason or other why they wanted messaging, because the Caulk, we did a lot of reconnaissance work for the fleet. In other words, we went ahead of the fleet wherever we were for reconnaissance. So we zip around with that thing. And there was another chore. When I was finally, we got back with the fleet, I was a helmsman. We had a number of them. I think there was about 8 of us that was up on the helm. That was our duty, other than when we needed to be on the torpedo mount. And I enjoyed that, really, I enjoyed it. But we went to WWII quite often, because every time before an operation, the whole fleet most of it would go back to WWII for repairs and supplies and so forth. And then we go on the next venture. But we'd always seem to go back to WWII and refit.
So this destroyer you on, what kind of jobs were you guys, what were you doing? What was a typical day like for you? And what kind of, were you involved in any invasions or?
Well, I was involved in maintaining the torpedoes. that was a major thing. And then I also had to be on the helm when they wanted me there. So it was between that and that. And another thing, I think those jobs are only put where, see, at that time we had only right arm rates. I think there were only 6 or 7 right arm rates. All the other rates were left arm. And right arm rates were a military branch. So like if we ever got somewhere where we went into port or so forth, and then you'd have to go into town on SP duty because only the military ones went on SP duty, armed. And my ship, it was four of us. It was a 38th Squadron. It was the Caulk I was on. There was the Gillespie, and there was the Wells and the Hobby. That was our squad that we. Anything else?
I was just gonna say, in what year did you get stationed on that destroyer?
Well, it was after that, at the time that destroyer went back to the States to be repaired, because they shipped me, like I said before, they shipped me back to the States because of my knowledge of the torpedoes, I guess. I went up to Puget Sound and, down to Maryland.
What was your impression of sailing around the Pacific? What was that like for you?
I enjoyed it. I went, well, I was at Formosa, Iwo Jima, Luzon. We patrolled the coastline of China, plus the Philippines, Corregidor. We were in Manila, and we were there for a short while, but I got to get on to Corregidor and where the Death March was and see all that stuff. And then we went to Okinawa. Can't forget that. It was my birthday we went there. And then from there we went to Tokyo. So we were one of the escorts into Tokyo Bay, and we were moored off the port side of the Missouri while the peace terms were being signed. So I could see that. And
when you went to Iwo Jima, just want to back up because you just rattled off a bunch of different islands there. What kind of support were you doing at Iwo Jima? Was it during the invasion? Was it after?
Well, we was reconnaissance before. That's what we did. We didn't do any bombing or anything on the island, no. But we were with, I think it was the Fifth Fleet at that time.
And then you guys went to Okinawa.
Yeah, and that was, then we were with the Third Fleet, and I think when we went to Okinawa, and we were there quite a while. That was bad there.
Why was it bad?
Well, with the Army, a lot of, it was really bad. And that's when the kamikazes started coming over. I didn't see any of them, but that's where they started. And then from there, of course, we went to Japan.
And what, any stories that really stick out to you from your time sailing around in the Pacific? Where, did you have any enemy submarine scares? Were you guys ever attacked? Anything like that?
Well, there was a period there where we were running into floating mines that the Japs had put in, and we'd blow them up. We'd lay to until we blew them up. And they were all recorded, that. You know, they used to put it on the ship. Um, it, it won, I think, eight awards through the war. Um, oh, and then, we also, the torpedo men handled the depth charges, which were called K guns on each side of the ship for submarines. And we had smoke screen on the back of the ship on the fantail. And we had some large, very large depth charges on a rack that you dropped. So that was all under the torpedo men's department, you know, rank. That we had to maintain all that stuff.
What was your general quarters battle station?
I was on the wheel. Unless you were needed for the torpedo tube, people, you know, the tube mount. But generally, that's always like when that's your last stand if you're in battle, really engaged in real battle, and it's your last resort. That's when you really use the torpedo.
Do you remember finding out about the war ending in Europe? Did that news make it to you guys?
Oh yes, we used to hear about it. Yeah.
What'd you think?
I thought it was. I'm glad I wasn't there.
You know, the surrender in Tokyo Bay is obviously a very famous moment. Can you take me through that and what it was like?
Well, while the signing of the peace terms aboard the Missouri, the sky was black with our B-29 bombers. The word was there was about 1,200 of them. I don't know if that's true or not, but it was just totally black with bombers. That was, of course, to show the Japanese our power, you know. And I was able to get off the ship there in Tokyo. And of course, Tokyo was just a pile of rubble. It was just bombed to death. Like you can imagine, you think it was an atom bomb did it, but I walked around in Tokyo there, and there was one building left standing, and that was a newspaper. And the west wall of it was all gone, and all the linotype was like flowed right out onto the street. And I had few pieces of that I picked up, and I walked up into the neighborhoods where the people lived, and a shrine. In the shrine, it was where the kamikazes pilots' remains are supposed to have been. Well, there was no remains, but what it was little caskets with their name on, and they were in a little shroud made over the top, all made of silk. And inside there was a silver metal polished like a mirror, that they figure they held that up at a ceremony so that the pilot, he would impress his image on it. That's what they believed. And that was inside this little casket, about that big. And they were all in pigeonholes in the shrine, you know.
What did you think of Japan?
I thought it was, well, what I saw of it, other than that it was all blown up, I thought it was pretty nice. Oh, and there was another thing. There was cliffs there in Tokyo, near the bay, very high cliffs, and they all were tunneled, different floors. And I walked up in there, and I walked in tunnels, and they were machine shops in there. All South Bend tools from the USA. Every tunnel, level of each tunnel was different machinery, and they had tool cribs in there where all the tools were, all American. And so I got wandering around, and I talked to any of them that could speak English, but I was not very much.
And you were walking around checking this out kind of right after the surrender?
Yes,
And then did you have to get back on your ship and go home?
yeah. Well, we didn't go home right away. We did more reconnaissance work, and that's where we found a lot of more floating mines south of Tokyo, but we were between Tokyo and Anahuac and back, and then I went down to the Philippines, to Manila, and I told you about that. That's when we went all that way, and then we went back to Japan again, and eventually we went back to the States through the Panama Canal.
Did you guys have any close call with mines?
And I remember when we went through the Panama Canal, it was a terrific thunderstorm, unbelievable. And we had, of course, a pilot, and I was on the helm, and I had to follow his directions because we couldn't see nothing, couldn't see where you were going. And I think we went into a little town where we tied up, I think it was called Coca-Cola, and it was pouring rain, but the crew wanted to get on shore, even though it was raining like that. It was really a mud hole, but there was a little Navy base there. And of course, when it all cleared up, we headed up to Boston, and then we went from there. It was repaired and everything, the ship was put in order. And then we went down to, I think it was Charleston, South Carolina, to be decommissioned put in the reserve fleet. And it was another thing. Most of the crew was released then, but there was one or two of each department. Like I was kept, because for the torpedo in the torpedo shop where all our tools were, we put cosmoline on all this stuff to preserve it for the future.
And I just want to jump back real quick. When you were around Tokyo Bay, did you guys have any close calls with mines?
Have any what?
Close calls with mines?
No, no, we didn't.
When you get back home, did you immediately leave the military? Did you go see your family? What was that whole process like getting back to the United States?
Well, that was really a funny deal. We had to go back to Great Lakes. And so I, being, like you said, I told you before, right arm rate, they gave me the chore of taking 3 other sailors with me, which were all left, like a cook and a seaman and a radioman. I had the draft to take them back to Great Lakes. And we were on a train, and of course I had to sign all their meal tickets on the train to be fed. And of course I was quite young yet, I was just 21. And but that was my job. I had to do it. So I made sure that when we went to a railroad station in some town on the way back to Wisconsin, I told them, don't get off this train, don't get off this train. But the cook and I, we got off the train and went across the street and got a beer. And the train whistled off, and we ran back to the depot and couldn't catch it. So there was a taxi cab sitting there, and I says, "Do you know where that train's going?" He says, "Yeah." I says, "Follow the train." That's what we did till we caught it. Yeah, that was funny. But it all worked out.
And what was going back home like for you?
Well, I went back home, and of course, I had one short leave while we were in San Francisco having that ship be built, and I met a woman, and we kept in touch. And when I got back, I looked her up, and pretty soon, that was even another funny deal. I remembered her phone number, but I didn't remember anywhere where she lived in Milwaukee. But I remembered the phone number for some reason, and I called her and asked her if we could meet, go out. And she says yes. So she told me where she lived, and she lived on 36 in Burnham in Milwaukee, which was a block off of the main drag that went over the valley. See, Milwaukee's on a big valley where the railroad was. And that was built by Frank Lloyd Wright. Anyhow, we started going together, and eventually we got married. And there was no housing in Milwaukee, you know, because of the war. Nothing was being built, so it was hard to find a place to live. And of course, I had to get a job. And my grandfather was I think he was about #1 engineer on the Milwaukee Road. And they were advertising for help, so I went down there. Of course, they interviewed you, and they had a stack of papers, you know, people listing they want a job. And of course, when they interviewed me, they says, "We'll call you," you know, and I thought, yeah, you know what that is, with that pile of papers. So I was just going out of the door, and this, well, he was what they call the chief engineer of the Milwaukee Road there. And he says, "Hey, kid, stop, come back here." So I went back, and he says, "Are you related to Oscar Flohr?" And I says, "Yeah, he's my grandfather." He's my grandfather. His job just like that. So I spent 37 and a half years on the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, which I retired from.
Seems like that job meant a lot to you.
Yes, but I had also had 29 years for Gimmel's department store at the same time. So my basic work week was like 13 hours a day.
That's a lot.
Because I worked 5 hours every morning at the Gimmel's department store, and then I went to the railroad. And of course, I didn't ever a lot of times I didn't get back in 8 hours because I'd get on a job where I was out of Milwaukee. So I'd get a lot of times home at 2, 3 in the morning, you know. But the way it worked everything on the railroad was by seniority. Whatever your day that you were hired, that was your date. So you got jobs according to your seniority that you could hold. So that's the way that job worked.
Wow, I know. I gotta cut you loose here at 4:15. You have somewhere to be. So I just want to end with just one question here. What are you most proud of with your military service? When you look back on your time in the Navy, what are you most proud about?
I enjoyed it. I had competition, which I liked all the time. I competed with, well, I actually aboard ship, I was young. I had to compete against all the older guys on the ship, you know. So I did all right, I think, for my age. And the system of getting ranks is different in the Army. They just appoint you a rank, you know, like a top sergeant and tell a corporal will make you buck sergeant. But in the Navy, you had to take an exam for it, and you had to have a time period in between taking the exam for whatever rate there was available. So you never knew how many torpedoman ranks there were, you know. I might be competing, taking an exam against 10 others. And that's how I got my ranks. But and I know I got 3.8 on my exam for ranks when I did it. That was another situation I had a problem with, but I don't know if you want to hear all that either.
Well, I know we're running out of time here for you, but
Yeah.
Again, maybe we can just go back to that
Well,
question.
the thing was that when I got that score, I should have got my rank, see, and they posted the ranks and they didn't post me as having the top score. And of course, the lieutenant came down and I asked him about it, and he says, well, you'll have to see the captain because he's the guy that signs it. So I went up and saw the captain, and his reason was that I was too young. And I said to him, I'm too young? I said, I wonder, do you know if that torpedoes will fire? And he says, certainly. I says, how do you know? I'm the guy that's been signing the book and everything. That's why they put me on that ship, you know. But guys came from wonder school, 90-day wonder school, you know, and they had higher ranks, and some of them had a higher rank than I had, but they got it right out of school, memorized the book, and that's about all. But they didn't know anything about torpedoes. So I had to train all them how to maintain them and pull them out and what to do with them to maintain them. And I was doing all that, and I was lower ranking with them. So I told them, well, I shall do only what my rank says I have to do. And then you get somebody else to sign the book, because every nut and bolt that you change on a torpedo, you have to enter it.
Now, Al, people are going to watch this interview, you know, a couple hundred years from now. What message would you leave for somebody in the future watching this tape?
Well, I think you get a good education in the service, even if it isn't schooling, you know, but you learn a lot. And you learn a lot about people in other parts of the world. I think, well, I thought it was great, even though there was a war going on. Because yeah. I never thought I'd get to be this age. That's one thing.